How do you stand in front of an audience and disrespect a legend, thinking you can walk away unscathed? That's the question Jimmy Kimmel was about to face. The stage was set for what should have been a casual interview. A few jokes, some easy banter, and a promotion for Clint Eastwood's latest film. But when Kimmel, the late-night host known for his sharp tongue, took the mic, he didn't realize the fire he was about to ignite. "You know, Clint," Kimmel joked, his grin wide, "maybe it's time for you to hang up your spurs and just stick to squinting in old westerns." The audience fell silent. Was it just a joke? To Kimmel, it seemed harmless. But Clint Eastwood wasn't just a man. He was a living legend, someone who had defined decades of cinema. He wasn't here to be mocked. His eyes, steely and unblinking, pierced through the air, and for a split second, the room held its breath. Eastwood leaned forward, his voice low, but carrying a weight that made it impossible to ignore. "You think that's funny?" he asked, his gaze never leaving Kimmel. "You think you can mock me for a laugh? I've faced wars. You haven't even begun to understand what's real." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut through. The laughter that once filled the space had evaporated, replaced by a deadly stillness. What was supposed to be a light-hearted interview had just become a confrontation, one that Kimmel wasn't ready for. The crowd held its breath. Kimmel, momentarily stunned, tried to brush it off with his usual charm. The smirk that had slipped away from his face slowly returned, though it was strained. "Come on, Clint," he said, attempting to ease the tension. "It's just a joke. You're a legend, you know that." But Eastwood wasn't laughing. The room, once filled with casual energy, was now thick with the weight of unspoken words. Eastwood's eyes, unyielding and calm, fixed on Kimmel as if daring him to say more. The quiet was deafening. "You think that's a joke?" Eastwood's voice was a quiet rumble, carrying a weight that demanded attention. "You think you can take shots at me and walk away? I've fought wars. I've seen things you'll never understand. And you mock that for a laugh?" The audience shifted, sensing the moment was much bigger than they had anticipated. They leaned in, hanging on to every word. "Making a living tearing people down," Eastwood continued, his tone firm but not loud. "That's your game, isn't it? Well, I'm not here for that." The power in his words didn't come from volume. It came from the sheer force of his experience, the life he had lived, and the dignity he carried with him. Kimmel tried to laugh it off again, but the usual ease in his tone was gone. The crowd was no longer with him. They were with Eastwood. Kimmel was losing control of the interview. The battle for respect had only just begun. Would he back down, or would this fiery exchange continue? Eastwood's silence was more powerful than any words Kimmel could muster. The room seemed to shrink with every passing second, the air thick with the weight of history. Clint Eastwood wasn't just a star, he was a symbol of resilience, a man whose very presence commanded respect. And Kimmel had poked the bear. Now, it wasn't about a joke. It was about legacy. "Do you understand what it means to have a legacy, Jimmy?" Eastwood asked, his voice calm, yet laced with a depth that cut through the tension. "You think because you have a mic in a talk show you're untouchable. You think you're important." The crowd held their breath, and for a moment it felt as though the entire studio was holding on to Eastwood's every word. "I've spent decades in this business. I've made films that have shaped generations, stories that matter." He leaned forward, his weathered hands resting on his knees, looking at Kimmel as if seeing straight through him. "I'm not here to play your game. I'm here for the work, for the people who've fought, for the stories that need to be told." Kimmel, visibly rattled, shifted in his seat. But Eastwood didn't stop. The legendary actor's gaze was unwavering, each word coming with the weight of a lifetime of hard-earned wisdom. "You mock my work, Jimmy, but you don't know what it means to sacrifice. You don't know what it means to give everything for something bigger than yourself, and that's why you'll never understand." The room erupted in applause. The crowd was with Eastwood. The power of his words, the clarity in his voice had struck a chord deep within them. Eastwood wasn't just defending his legacy. He was defending something much bigger. What would Kimmel do now? Would he continue the fight? or would he realize the enormity of what he had just stirred up? Behind Kimmel's charm and the easy smiles was a man who, deep down, didn't know how to hold his own when faced with real power, real substance. He had built his career by taking shots at others, reducing them to punchlines to get a laugh. But Clint Eastwood wasn't just a name to be poked at. He wasn't a joke. As the weight of Eastwood's words settled, Kimmel's bravado began to crack. The audience could feel it, the shift from Kimmel's usual confidence to something darker, something more vulnerable. "You think you're untouchable, Clint?" Kimmel finally retorted, his voice rising, as though to compensate for the tremor that threatened to creep into his words. "You're just a guest here. And you're making a fool of yourself." The words, desperate and thin, hung in the air, but Eastwood didn't flinch. He wasn't intimidated. Instead, he leaned back, eyes still locked on Kimmel, and shook his head slowly. "You think you know what's serious?" Eastwood's voice cut through, steady as ever. "I've been doing this longer than you've been alive, kid. I've seen more in one day than you could even dream of. You want to talk about being a fool?" Eastwood's eyes flashed with intensity, the room hanging on every word. "You're a fool for thinking you could take down a man like me with a cheap shot." The crowd, which had been relatively silent until now, erupted into applause. It wasn't just about Eastwood's words. It was about his presence, his refusal to be dismissed. Kimmel, caught off guard, sat frozen for a moment. Kimmel had pushed too far. The fight for dominance had shifted in Eastwood's favor. But would Kimmel try to salvage his position? Or had he lost the crowd for good? The room was now completely divided. The tension was palpable. Kimmel tried to recover, but there was no going back. He had miscalculated. The audience's energy had already shifted toward Eastwood. The veteran actor had earned his place, not through flash and gimmicks, but through grit, through a lifetime of dedication. "You're a has-been, Clint," Kimmel spat, the words dripping with venom. "Nobody cares about your war movies anymore. They're relics, just like you." The insult was a final desperate attempt to regain control. But it was a mistake that would haunt Kimmel. The audience's reaction was immediate. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by a low, rolling murmur of disapproval. Eastwood didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice, steady and deliberate, carried the weight of decades of sacrifice. "You don't get to talk about those stories," he said softly, each word cutting deeper than any scream could. "You've never known what it's like to fight for something that matters. You don't know what it's like to give everything, to lose everything." The crowd roared, their loyalty firmly with Eastwood now. Kimmel's smirk, the one he'd clung to so tightly for years, was gone, replaced by a scowl. The weight of his words, once sharp, had now turned against him. Kimmel had made a critical error. The audience had spoken, and they had sided with Eastwood. But the confrontation wasn't over yet. Would Kimmel have the strength to admit his mistake, or would he continue to dig deeper? The room was charged with an intensity that no one had expected. Kimmel, now visibly rattled, tried to control the situation, but it was slipping through his fingers. His voice cracked, the pressure mounting. "You're too old for this, Clint," he shot back, his words growing more desperate. "Maybe you're too stuck in the past to understand how things work now." The audience's reaction was instantaneous, an unmistakable wave of disapproval. The jeers were quiet but unmistakable, the crowd no longer willing to back a man who thought he could tear down a legend for a cheap laugh. Eastwood didn't move. He was still, calm, but his presence was like a storm on the horizon. His voice was a quiet growl, like thunder before the rain. "The game?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "I've been in this business longer than you've been alive, kid. You think you can play the game by tearing people down? You don't get to tell me what's serious. You have no idea what it takes to stand for something, to put everything on the line for what you believe in." Eastwood's words hit harder than any punch. The audience, who had been hanging on the edge of their seats, now stood in support, a wave of cheers rising up to meet him. The applause thundered, echoing through the room, drowning out Kimmel's feeble attempts to maintain control. Kimmel, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment, could feel the ground beneath him shifting. He had lost them. The power of Eastwood's words was undeniable. Kimmel's confidence was shattered, and the crowd was with Eastwood now. What would Kimmel do next? Would he try to save face? Or was this the moment when everything changed? Kimmel, unable to regain control, stood up, trying to match Eastwood's intensity. "You think you're untouchable, Clint?" He spat, his voice trembling but trying to hold some semblance of authority. "You're just a guest here, and you're making a fool of yourself." Eastwood didn't flinch. His expression remained steady, unbothered, his eyes fixed on Kimmel. The room had turned into a battlefield, and Clint Eastwood wasn't one to back down. Eastwood stood up slowly, his towering presence filling the room. His boots, heavy and deliberate, echoed on the polished floor as he began to walk toward Kimmel's desk. He stopped just a few steps away, the space between them now charged with palpable tension. "You want to talk about relevance?" Eastwood's voice was a low rumble, commanding the room's attention. "Let's talk about you sitting there pretending you're somebody because you've got a talk show." "You're nothing without guests like me." The crowd erupted, their applause shaking the walls. Kimmel's face contorted with anger, but the more he tried to fight back, the further he sank. The tables had turned, and it was clear who had won. Eastwood was walking off. This moment, this exit, was becoming something bigger than either of them. But Kimmel wasn't ready to let go just yet. What would he say in the face of this public humiliation? Eastwood's exit wasn't just a walk-off, it was a statement. The audience, still standing and clapping, couldn't contain their admiration. He wasn't just leaving the stage, he was leaving a legacy that couldn't be diminished by cheap jabs or mockery. As Eastwood's back straightened and his figure disappeared behind the curtain, the applause was deafening. He had done what few men could, stood his ground in the face of disrespect, and walked away with his dignity intact. Kimmel, on the other hand, sat frozen. His attempt at mocking Eastwood had backfired spectacularly. The weight of the moment settled in, and all he could do was stare at the spot where the legendary actor had just stood. The next day, the world had already moved on from the late-night talk show. The confrontation between Kimmel and Eastwood had spread far beyond the studio. News outlets were running headlines like, "Clint Eastwood owns Jimmy Kimmel in explosive showdown," and "Kimmel humiliated by Eastwood's walk-off." Eastwood's film, the heart of this storm, saw a surge in ticket sales. People weren't just interested in the movie. They were showing support for the man who had refused to bow down to a bully. It wasn't just about a film. It was about respect, legacy, and the strength to stand firm. As Clint Eastwood drove away from the studio, the noise of the world seemed to fade into the distance. The city lights blurred outside the window of his black SUV, but inside, all was still. Eastwood, ever the quiet man, let out a deep breath. His longtime friend and producer, Tom, sat beside him, still shaking his head with a grin. "You sure know how to make an exit." "Clint," Tom chuckled, glancing over at him. Eastwood's eyes were fixed ahead, but a small smile tugged at his lips. "He asked for it, Tom. You don't poke a bear and expect it to stay calm." But Eastwood wasn't just talking about. In the days following the broadcast, the news cycles were consumed with one thing: Clint Eastwood's walk-off. It wasn't just a moment of confrontation. It was a reminder to the public about what truly matters. The press celebrated Eastwood's unyielding spirit, his refusal to be diminished by a host who thought he could cross the line for a laugh. On social media, the backlash against Kimmel was swift. Memes circulated, with people praising Eastwood's dignity and condemning Kimmel's childish behavior. The viral moment went beyond just entertainment. Kimmel sat alone in his dressing room, the lights from the set still burning bright in his peripheral vision, but he didn't feel their warmth. His usual quick wit, the defense mechanism he'd relied on for years, had failed him. The confrontation with Eastwood had shaken him to his core in a way he hadn't anticipated. The echo of Eastwood's words rang in his ears, especially the line, "You don't know what it's like to give everything for something that matters." The following week, Kimmel appeared on air with a somber expression. The usual charisma was gone, replaced by a sincerity that couldn't be feigned. He opened the show with a rare admission, an apology, not just for the incident with Eastwood, but for the way he'd treated his guests, his audience, and, ultimately, his own values. "I was wrong," he said, looking directly into the camera. "I've spent a lot of years making jokes, poking fun, thinking that was the way to connect with people. But tonight, I want to say something different. Clint Eastwood is a legend, a man who has earned respect, not just for what he's done on screen, but for who he is. And I failed to recognize that. I made a mistake, and I've learned a lot from it. The audience sat in stunned silence for a moment, unsure of what to make of the rare moment of vulnerability. But slowly, as Kimmel continued, they began to understand. He wasn't just apologizing for an out-of-control interview. He was recognizing that sometimes the only way to move forward is to stop running, stop hiding behind jokes, and face the truth head-on. Behind the scenes, Kimmel's ratings slowly started to recover. The apology, while not enough to erase the damage, began to show a side of him people hadn't seen before. He wasn't the snarky late-night host anymore. He was someone trying to learn, trying to grow. The battle for respect had been fought, but the lessons learned in the aftermath would last a lifetime. Would Kimmel's apology be enough to reclaim the trust of his audience, or was this a new chapter for him, forever marked by his moment of weakness? Clint Eastwood had already walked away with his dignity and legacy intact, leaving a lasting impact not just on Kimmel, but on the world watching. The confrontation wasn't just about a TV moment. It was a reminder that respect isn't given. It's earned, and sometimes standing up for yourself means walking away from the fight entirely.